At the beginning of the film, Bryan appears with his mother, talking to her about his desire to use his legal career to help others, especially those on death row in unjust cases. His mother advises him to take care of himself, for fear of encountering people in society who will not like what he does. Bryan Stevenson, a recent Harvard Law School graduate, arrives in Alabama to provide legal aid to death row inmates. He meets Ava Ansley, who helps him establish the Equal Justice Initiative. They face difficulties finding an office due to discrimination. Bryan visits Holman State Penitentiary to meet Walter Johnny D. McMillian, convicted of murdering a white woman. McMillian is disillusioned and questions Bryan's intentions. Bryan assures him of his commitment to justice. Bryan witnesses the harsh conditions and despair in the death row cell. He speaks with other inmates, including Herbert Richardson, a Vietnam War veteran. The inmates recount stories of racial discrimination and a lack of adequate legal representation. Bryan investigates the details of McMillian's conviction, uncovering evidence of witness coercion and falsified testimony. The only real evidence comes from Ralph Myers, whose story contradicts his own. Bryan decides to confront Myers personally. Bryan visits Myers in prison, trying to convince him to recant his testimony. Myers initially resists, fearing the repercussions. Bryan interacts with Myers in a very professional and calm manner, allowing him to speak in an attempt to gain his sympathy for the case and express his human side. In fact, Myers begins his conversation by talking about his children and how attached he is to them. Bryan mentions that McMillian has children who need his care, that he is in prison, and that he will be executed for his testimony. Bryan asks him directly if he gave false testimony in the case, and if anyone forced him to do so. Myers answered indirectly, and Bryan understood that Myers had indeed given false testimony under duress. Local authorities and community members resisted Bryan's efforts. The sheriff and the district attorney warned him that the case was over and that McMillian would be sentenced to death. Bryan spoke to them and confirmed that the testimony in the case was false and that his client, McMillian, was innocent, as there was no evidence against him other than Myers's false testimony. Herbert Richardson was executed despite Bryan's plea for clemency. The horrific scene depicts the inhumane process and Richardson's final moments. Bryan was deeply affected by the brutality of the death penalty. Bryan and Eva Ansley discovered that Myers's false testimony had been given 2 months after his interrogation. Bryan attempted to access the archives to search for files and recordings from his initial interrogation, hoping to uncover the truth. With the help of Eva Ansley, he contacted an archivist she knew, and Bryan obtained the box containing Myers' interrogation information. Bryan found recordings confirming that Myers, at the beginning of his interrogation, had asserted that he had not seen McMillian at the scene and that he would not give false testimony that would lead to the imprisonment of an innocent person. Bryan returned to Myers and confronted him with the latest developments and evidence. Myers admitted that the authorities had forced him to do so under the threat of execution, and that he had actually gone to the execution site and stayed there for several days. Myers told Bryan that his face was scarred and burned from a fire he had suffered as a child caused by a home heater. He also explained that the smell of burning skin he had smelled while a convict was being electrocuted reminded him of a traumatic childhood experience, which prompted him to agree to give false testimony. Bryan asked Myers to testify in court and use him as a witness, but Myers refused. In fact, Bryan sought Myers' assistance in the case and was surprised to find that Myers confirmed Bryan's claim that his testimony was false and that he had been coerced into giving it. Bryan turned to a dismissed police officer who confirmed that Myers' description of the victim's condition in his testimony was not what the officer had seen upon discovering the incident. Myers also sought help from a psychiatrist who had treated him, who confirmed that Myers had admitted to having been pressured by authorities to change his statement. In a dramatic scene, despite all this evidence of McMillian's innocence, and to the astonishment of those present, the judge ignores this in his ruling, based on the fact that there is no evidence that Myers' first testimony was incorrect, and that the psychological pressure on Myers during the recent period and his presence in prison led to his changing his statements the second time. Bryan goes to McMillian in prison again and apologizes to him, but McMillian does not accept Bryan's apology and urges him to complete what he started and thanks him because he is the only one who believed in his innocence, and Bryan assures him that he will complete what he started. Bryan gains media attention, raising awareness of McMillian's wrongful conviction. Public pressure on the justice system begins to grow. Bryan gives a compelling interview, exposing flaws in the case. Bryan requested that the case be referred to the Supreme Court and requested a retrial after his last disappointment. The prosecutor requested a postponement of the case, which angered Bryan because the prosecutor postponed the case to search for evidence against McMillian. Bryan went to him and explained that there was no reason to postpone the case, as the case was settled and there was not a single piece of evidence against McMillian. He told him that he shouldn't repeat his wrongful manner. The Supreme Court eventually approved the retrial. Before the Supreme Court, in a solemn and moving scene, Bryan asked the judge to choose between the rule of law and the rule of fear, explaining that no one had helped him in the case except a few due to their fear of the prosecutor and the authorities. Dramatically, McMillian was acquitted of all charges after the judge asked the prosecutor if he still believed McMillian was guilty. The prosecutor replied that after reviewing the evidence, he was certain that McMillian was not guilty. The film ends with a call to action, reminding viewers of the importance of confronting racial injustice. Bryan's unwavering commitment is a beacon of hope. The story serves as both an inspiration and a sobering reminder of the flaws in the justice system. Please share your thoughts about the future film in the comment section. If you haven't already, please remember to subscribe to us and leave a like if you enjoyed our material. Be careful and have a nice one.